And so we first domesticated animals 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, my God, that seems so long ago. It's so historically remote. But on an evolutionary time scale, a generation is considered to be 30 years. That's only been 333 human generations. So we still have the genetic makeup of Stone Agers. We are literally Stone Agers living in the space age, and we have genes and bodies and digestive systems that are very well adapted to the foods that we have always consumed. And so these recent introductions, here's the first time cereal grains were introduced. Believe it or not, we talk about grains as the staples and the staff of life. They have only been domesticated in the same time frame. The first dairying evidence we see from about 9,000 years ago, but probably people were consuming dairy products once they had domesticated these animals. So this just represents a lag in the fossil record. Okay, wine and beer. Nobody had any fun until 6,000, 7,000 years ago. Okay, the first salt mines in Europe appear about a little bit after that. And sucrose, which is table sugar, was first produced in India about 2,500 years ago. But the thing is, it was made from cane sugar, and it wasn't exported around the world. So only a few people had it, and the rest of the world simply didn't have it until much later. Okay, the Industrial Revolution, this is when things really started to change, and let's take a look at this. Okay, so this is when table sugar, or sucrose, became available to the masses, was starting at about 1798, the turn of the century, whenever, 200 years ago. Okay, feedlot produced meats, fatty meats. That never ever happened. We didn't have the technology to bring cows and grain to market and produce these fatty meats that are ubiquitous in our diet now. Refined grains, okay, white bread, white rice, all of these things are technological innovations. We never did these until fairly recent times, and I'll show you the technology that allowed for that. Refined vegetable oils. In all processed foods, we put refined vegetable oils in them, but once again, you can see a very recent addition to the Western diet. And when you look at it from a generational perspective, obviously our genes have not changed in 3 or 4 generations. We have the same genes, our grandparents, our great-grandparents. We have basically the same genes that people had 10,000 years ago. So this is an onslaught to our physiology and our health to throw 70% of our calories into our diet in the mere time frame of 4 or 5 human generations. Hydrogenated vegetable oils a little bit later still. And HFCS, what's that? High fructose corn syrup. Now, when I was as young as some of the people here in this audience, this stuff didn't exist, all right? Okay, this is kind of a fun slide. We'll just rip through it, but this is when processed and junk food came about. There's Hershey chocolate bar, 1900. We can hear applause if we hit one of your favorites. Pepsi, 1902. Kellogg's Corn Flakes, 1906. Crisco, 11. Oreos have been around since 1913. I guarantee you they'll never, ever go away. Wonder Bread, 1921. Rice Krispies. You know those Rice Krispie treats? You couldn't have eaten those before 1928. Oh, Corn Chips, 1932. M&M's. Now that's one that definitely will not go away. Sugar Frosted Flakes. And Pringles Chips, 1969. Okay. So when we look at these Neolithic and industrial era food introductions, they cause a lot of problems in our physiology and our health and our well-being. We identified 7 key characteristics, and let me just walk you through these because you may not have a nutritional background, but the glycemic load is very important. The way a food impacts our blood sugar, we can measure it. And foods that really raise our blood sugar or blood glucose have high glycemic loads. So the white bread right here, these potatoes, and this drink all absolutely do a number on our blood glucose. The unfortunate part of this is they also elevate our insulin. Insulin is a master hormone, and it causes lots and lots of problems. Fatty acid balance. The types of fats that are in this hot dog are way different than what we find in the tissue of wild animals. The macronutrient balance. In the Western diet, we eat primarily carbohydrates. They're our major source of energy, whereas in Stone Age diets, the predominant energy source was either protein and fat and carbohydrate was always low. And so that's a characteristic pattern, high protein, low carbohydrate, that we're finding out now from randomized controlled trials is healthful for humans. Trace nutrient density. There's no vitamins and minerals in here, and when you consume that, you are displacing real food, fruits and vegetables. Acid-base balance. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but if you eat a lot of fruits and veggies, you have a net base-yielding urine. And sodium, potassium, we salt everything, so we have way more salt than we do potassium, and there's no fiber left in these things because they're entirely fiber depleted. These 7 nutritional characteristics wreak havoc with our body, and we can trace them to many, many diseases. The symphony orchestra plays not with a single instrument, but together. And so all of these factors synergistically impair our health and our well-being. Okay, let's look at these one by one and show you why they were not part of the hunter-gatherer diets. Let's take a look at cereal grains. If we look at grains, about a quarter of our calories come from cereal grains. Unfortunately, this is the type of cereal grains we eat in America. We eat these refined grains with high glycemic load, and that adversely affects our health and well-being. How do we know that hunter-gatherers didn't eat cereal grains? Well, first off, cereal grains are the seeds of grasses. And in their wild state, they're very small, they're difficult to harvest, and you got to do a lot of things to them to make them edible. You got to grind them up and you got to cook them. Otherwise, the starch and the proteinism is not available to you. So it represents a lot of work. And there's a theory called optimal foraging theory in anthropology. And if you go out and you're a forager, you got to get more energy from the food than you expend. Okay? If you go out and you hunt and gather all day long, you come back with 50 calories, it's a bust. So you got to come back. You got to get more energy than what you expend. And these foods are rotten at getting energy back because it takes so much energy to collect them and process them and cook them and build a fire and all this that hunter-gatherers basically ignored these and viewed them as starvation foods. So when do we first see these grains being included in our diet? It's when in the fossil record we see these crude grinding stones. And so this occurred in a culture in the Mideast called the Natufians, roughly 10 to 15,000 years ago. Up until about 1880, the way we ground our cereal grains up to make our bread and our flour was with these stone grinding tools. This is how it was first done. And then later on, we built these water wheels that turned these gears that ground these stones together. And when we made our flour, everything was mixed together. There's 3 parts of a wheat berry. There's the germ, the bran, and the endosperm. And so when we do it like this, everything gets mixed up together, and we call that flour 100% extraction flour. So that's perhaps not as unhealthy as white flour. And that's pretty much how it was done up until about 1880. And then in 1880, what happened, we invented these things called steel roller mills. And if you look up here, you can see that we fundamentally have changed the way in which we're breaking up the wheat berry. Instead of pulverizing it and grinding it with these stones, we're putting it through and squeezing it. And when we squeeze it, a couple of things happens. Is the germ and the bran come off as a nice little flake, and we can sieve them out very easily. And then once we sieve them out, we don't stop there. We continue putting the flour through multiple breaks until we get these tiny little particles, and that's what we make our white bread out of. Now, it was done at the time because people liked this nice white flour without any bran or germ in it, but had they known the adverse health effects of doing this, it probably would have never happened. So here's what happens to the glycemic index. We talked about the glycemic index, the ability of a food to raise our blood sugar. And what you see right here is we start off with a whole wheat kernel, 100% extraction, where we keep the bran and the germ and everything intact. It has a low glycemic index. And by the time we're down here to making these fancy flours that we use for all kinds of fancy pastries and whatever, the glycemic index has risen to 70 or 80. And if you look over here, this is a list of foods. These are common cereal, refined grains. And you notice almost every single refined grain up here has a high glycemic index, which is defined as greater than 70. So you think about healthy foods like Cheerios. They're advertising them as heart healthy. Well, I don't think so, not based on the glycemic index by any means. And so What's some other ones here? People like bagels. You can see bagels are typically high glycemic load foods. All right, well, what's wrong with high glycemic